I'm Steve Ryder, producer of the Breakpoint Podcast. Today we present Session 3 of Doing the Right Thing, an exploration of ethics with Brit Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson. As with those other sessions that we heard in past weeks, this episode was filmed in front of a live studio audience. So let's get right to session number 3, which is titled, If We Know What Is Right, Can We Do It? Here is series host Brit Hume.
For those of you who have been with us for the first 2 sessions, you know that they have dealt with the cause of the financial crisis of 2008, which our panelists have traced to a crisis of ethics in American life. The second issue our panel has discussed with the students is whether there is knowable truth. Are there moral absolutes? That's a provocative question in today's relativistic environment. The panelists in the second session, however, concluded that truth is knowable. We can know what is right. But that leads to the big question we're going to discuss with the students today, and that is, even if we know what is right and just, can we do it? Join us in the classroom. We're very glad to be back with all of you today. Today's session is perhaps the most challenging of the 6 we're conducting. If truth is knowable, and by extension, therefore, right is knowable, then the next question is whether we have the discipline and the will to do what is right. We didn't have to look far to find someone who could speak with some authority on this question. Chuck Colson, one of our hosts, was a key figure in the great Watergate scandal. He was special counsel to President Nixon. He went to prison. He faced this question with some dramatic consequences.
When President Nixon asked me to leave my law firm in Washington and come in and be his special counsel, the first thing I did was to be certain there'd be no conflicts of interest. I took everything I'd earned as a lawyer, I put it in a blind trust. I told my law partners not to come visit me, and they didn't. I was certain that I would never be compromised. I was determined not to be. And I'd been raised this way. I'd been a Marine officer. I'd learned about duty and honor, and I learned about integrity as a Marine. And as a kid growing up in the Depression in tough economic times, my dad was going to school at night, studying to be a lawyer, and he was working days, but on the weekends he'd spend some time with me. He said, Chuck, one thing, always tell the truth and never lie. When you work as hard as you possibly can, no matter what it is. He even used the example of cleaning toilets. He said, doesn't matter what you're doing, do it well. Earn your pay. Do a hard day's work for an honest day's pay. Pay your bills. I mean, I was steeped in what we then knew as the Puritan work ethic. And being honest, this was a big thing with me. I would get gifts at Christmas time, for example, and I would take them down to the White House switchboard operators, the guys that drove my cars, because I was never going to be compromised. And I was so determined, I ended up going to prison. Why? I think you can be so self-righteous that you don't see what's really going on. You become oblivious to your own insensitivities because you're sure nobody can compromise you. Human beings have the infinite capacity of self-rationalization, and that's exactly what I did. I was in a lot of meetings where there were high stakes, where the President of the United States would say, national security depends on this. Kissinger came in fulminating one day over some documents that had been stolen, and he said, this is going to compromise all of national security. I can think back on times, I remember when the president, 4 or 5 of us in the office, and the president was exploding over something that had gotten out and was in the hands of the Brookings Institution, and he turned to Bob Holdham. He said, Bob, have we got a team in place that can go in and get those documents back? Remember, I've asked you for that. Then I later realized that was a time when I should have stopped and said, wait a minute, Mr. President, think about the consequences of this. But I did not. Self-righteousness is believing you're so good that you couldn't be compromised. And that's the kind of pride that's fatal, and was in my life, because I was so sure of myself that I didn't realize how vulnerable I was, as every human being is.
It raises an intriguing question. What about the transformation of the stubborn human will? A good subject for our panel. Professor George?
Well, thinkers from many traditions wrestled with the question, what is the proper relationship in the human being, in the human soul, between reason and passion, or reason and emotion, reason and feeling? Plato taught, and C.S. Lewis affirmed, that in a properly ordered soul, in a person who really has it together, reason will be in control, and passion will be under the control of reason, and reason will direct passion to the good and the right. So our passions will be passions for doing what's good, what's virtuous, what's noble, what's upright. But of course, unfortunately, our passions can go in the other direction. We're naturally broken creatures. Christians have an understanding of that. We call it original sin. We're naturally weak, not only our wills, but also our intellects. When faith and reason are operating well together, when reason is in control of the passions, then the passionate aspect of man can lead us to do great things, to do really great things, heroic things, because we're passionate for them. But where things are out of whack, where reason's under the thumb of the passions, things can go very badly. And Chuck Colson's personal story illustrates that extremely well.
That raises the intriguing question of, how do you direct passion? I mean, your reason may tell you that you have some objective in mind, some accomplishment, some public service that you should do. But the only passion you might have is for that woman you just saw walking down the hall. And that's where your passion and temptation at that time lie. So how does that process work?
I think conversion is the key to it. In my case, it was simple because Christ came into my life, and that gave me a whole new way of seeing life and a whole new worldview. But I think the conversion is central to everybody. I think there's a point at which that has to happen. Sam and I talked about the fact that people have to be converted. He said crime was caused by people making wrong moral choices, and the answer to crime was the conversion of the wrongdoer to a more responsible lifestyle. So how do you bring about that transformation? Now, that's where Lewis was talking.
Now we hear from Michael Miller of the Action Institute.
That's the kind of the key human question, right? I mean, how do you know what's good, and then how do you do it? I mean, first of all, I'd say that passions aren't bad, right? Passions are good. We're created with these drives, these passions. And what happens, though, is then they become so focused that they take over us. And so they have to be guided by reason. Now, Lewis, as you pointed out, he says that the head, the intellect, rules the belly, the passions, right, through the chest. Right? The head rules the belly through the chest. Well, how do you do that?
What's the chest?
Well, here's an example I've given before. Since I've given the animal, I'll give you another animal example. The belly are the passions, and that's like a big, huge 800-pound gorilla who's saying, I want, right? And all of us can experience, the 800-pound gorilla, right? I mean, maybe it's a little thing like, I'm not going to say a bad thing about that person. Isn't she just the worst? It comes out, right? So you've got this gorilla, and then against the 800-pound gorilla, you've got this little tiny intellect in a bow tie with a professor saying, well, actually, that's not the right thing to do, and I think you should realize that. And so, of course, what does the 800-pound gorilla say? Boom, I want, all right? So Lewis says, well, that's not enough, right? What we need is a strong chest. And I think he talks about reasonable emotions, or what John Paul II has called spiritual emotions. And this is a deep love of truth and goodness and beauty, that we have a vision of nobleness, of excellence. Aristotle said that a good life is a life of virtue, the Greek word is arete, of living a life of excellence, repeated over and over again. But we have to have in our minds an image and a picture of what that virtue, noble thing is that can overcome the passion, right?
And we're talking really about an exercise of will in a very sort of down-to-earth sense.
Well, that's just exactly what C.S. Lewis said, Britt. Let me quote it because it's really important. As the king governs by his executive, so reason in man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. That is the seat of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. That's discipline, and it's the will.
Dr. Robert George joins in.
Yeah, what you're doing is you're training your emotions. Yeah. So reason's in that educating role. What it comes down to is having things in the proper order. Now, what does it mean to have it together, to get things in the proper order? Well, it comes down to integrity. It's a matter of integrity. Now, how do we go about becoming people of integrity? Well, there's two interesting things that might seem paradoxical when we put them together, but they're true. One is, no one can do it for you. In other words, no one can just give you the gift of integrity. Even your parents can't do that, right? They can help, but they can't do it. Integrity is achieved by doing good acts for good reasons, and avoiding doing bad acts because you understand them to be bad acts. And only you can do that, right? So we're, to some extent, sort of on our own. But at the same time, and this might sound paradoxical, but I don't think it is in the end, nobody can really do it alone. We can't train our emotions just on our own. We all rely on, first, our parents, on our religious communities, on other institutions of civil society, associations to which we belong. But for those organizations, those institutions, to do their jobs in helping us to achieve integrity, they have to be in healthy, good shape. And there's the problem. In circumstances where the family has lost its integrity, in situations where churches and other private associations are severely compromised or corrupted, in situations where the larger culture is suffering corruptions, those institutions cannot play their subsidiary role, subsidiary but important role, in helping us to form good characters, to be people of integrity.
Let's get you students into this discussion. Who's got a question? Yes, sir.
Stephen Lindsay, I'm an undergraduate student here at Princeton, and I was wondering if the panel could maybe address modern colleges and universities, because it seems to me that this kind of the liberationist principle of trying to remove restraints on behavior and remove restraints on passions and desires is definitely more prevalent today in American liberal arts institutions than, let's say, the notion of pursuing truth for the point of perfecting oneself. And I was wondering, what exactly should a liberal arts education, what should its culture really look like in today's society?
Glenn Sunshine responds.
My first response, and I'm saying this as a history professor, my first response to this idea of removing restraints is, how's that working for you? Because the fact of the matter is, observationally, it's resulting in more pain, more brokenness, more harm to the individuals involved, to the society in general, than pretty much anything else that I can think of that's happened in society in my lifetime. It is unutterably destructive. I would suggest that in many ways, looking to the university to act on it is a mistake. Ultimately, I think you're going to have to take responsibility yourself, because the way the university is structured right now, they're not going to help you.
There's a sad and really tragic irony, and anyone who's studied human history knows about this. The sure consequence of the attempt to liberate oneself from demanding moral norms and obligations is slavery. In fact, it's the most abject form of slavery, slavery to one's own passions, to one's own desires. Now, in the context of liberal arts education, when it's done really well, when we enter into the great conversation with Plato or with St. Augustine or with Dante or Alexis de Tocqueville or the authors of the Federalist Papers, when we really do liberal arts education right, what's on offer to us is something really profound, and that is an understanding of the good and the true and the beautiful. And why is that worth having? Because that offers us ultimate liberation from that worst form of slavery, slavery to self, slavery to one's own passions and desires.
Again, Michael Miller.
Can I say one quick thing?
Please.
Two quick points. One is, ethics, the way it's been articulated, if you look to Aristotle and Plato, Aquinas, Augustine, ethics is the study of how to lead a good life in order to be happy. But the other thing with freedom is that the concept of freedom merely as liberation is an irrational concept. It's not a coherent, it doesn't hold. Because the idea of freedom, and this comes from medieval problems of nominalism and a host of other things, the idea of freedom is merely exercising your will. I'm just going to do what I want, right? But that's severed from truth and from reason. So if I said to you, well, thank you, it's nice to talk to you, and I started banging my head on this chair, most of you would look at me and think, wow, he's really free. You would not think that I was really free. You'd think that I'd lost my mind, because banging my head on this chair is not an act of freedom. It's not an act of liberation. It's severed from truth and reason. And so the whole liberationist project is faulty from the foundation. And I think that we need to think rightly about it, and also, like Professor Sunshine said, get into what Toynbee talked about, creative minorities or little platoons of Edmund Burke and rebuild a culture of freedom rooted in truth and responsibility.
Let me give you an illustration. I've traveled about the country giving speeches on ethics. One of the places, the only place I got really good questions, was at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, the 2nd Marine Division. And a grizzly master sergeant, gunnery sergeant, stood up in the question period and he said, "Mr. Colson, which is more important? We're Marines, semper fidelis, loyalty or integrity?" And my mind instantly flashed back to that moment in the White House when Nixon said, "We got to break in to get these papers." That's when integrity kicks in. Integrity, what does integrity mean?
Wholeness.
Wholeness, yeah. So you're an integrated person. Like the ship goes to sea, watertight integrity is all the leaks, all the watertight doors are shut. You got to be one person.
Isn't there a very vital role, actually, for emotion itself in directing our behavior? For example, if we are aware of and to some extent obedient to the moral code that we believe is somewhat, to some extent, inherent in us, and we are violating it or about to or tempted to, isn't one of the things that may hold us back the fear of how we're going to feel if we do? That anxiety about, I know if I do that, I'm going to hate myself for it.
But that'll only happen if your emotions are properly educated. Yeah. That is, if reason's done its work, assisted by families and institutions of civil society.
You have to basically accept the code in order to feel bad about violating.
And here's something that human experience validates very thoroughly, and that is that once you begin to break the code, you'll feel badly about it the first time, a little less badly about it the second time, a little less badly about it the third time. And that's the experience of human corruption.
Good point.
If you set out to corrupt a person, to make the person morally worse, just start eroding it. Get them to do the bad act the first time.
But what about this question of how you change someone who has already been on a certain course? Professor?
Well, sometimes the advice is given, follow your conscience. Now, that's good advice, but it can be misleading advice because our consciences are fallible. Even a judgment made in conscience, sincerely, can be erroneous, can lead us down the wrong path. So the first thing we need to do in the process of reform is to inform our consciences, to be reflective, to draw on the resources of faith and reason, to really understand what's right and true and good. It seems to me that that's a first and indispensable step. Conscience is not the permissions department. It's not in the business of licensing whatever we want to do. The great 19th century British religious thinker John Henry Newman famously said that conscience is a stern monitor. Doesn't write permission slips. It says thou shalt or thou shalt not. It hands down rules. Too often, I think, today, in this environment of relativism, under this dictatorship of relativism, as the Pope says, we appeal to conscience just to license us to do whatever we want to do. We appeal to it against the moral law rather than understanding it as the demand of the moral law made upon us.
Yeah, conscience becomes basically what you feel at the moment. And what you feel at the moment is almost always the worst guide of what you should do, especially when the situation's difficult.
We're talking about virtues. I mean, we're talking about the acquisition of virtues. So the first thing we need to do is to try to inform our consciences with the resources that are available. That's what parents try to do for their children. That's what religious communities try to do when they're functioning at their best. But then we have to talk about what the virtues are. Courage was a virtue known to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and it truly is a virtue. There are some contributions, I think, that are distinctive in the Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think it's very important for us to praise those virtues, to lift those virtues up, to encourage our people, especially our young people, to strive to realize those virtues in their lives.
You mentioned courage. A military organization is obviously in need of people who have it. The United States Marine Corps is famous for having a few good men. So, how does the Marine Corps go about instilling that? Someone who can tell us about that.
We now hear from retired Marine Corps Captain Donovan Campbell.
The fundamental premise to the Marine Corps character building experience is that everyone has to be given a common base. There's got to be a foundation that the Marine Corps sets that's the same for everyone, that everyone understands fundamentally is right. The Marines have been doing something for 230 plus years. For 230 plus years, it has worked. There's absolutely no reason to change their character building philosophy to conform to fads or fashion. How do they instill this sense of foundation in every single Marine? They do this by taking in young Marines into boot camp, young officers in officer candidate school, which is the officer version of boot camp, and breaking them down. And they tell them all, listen, you are not a special snowflake. There is nothing wonderful and amazing about you that makes you uniquely qualified to operate outside of the Marine Corps system. You outside of the Marine Corps system cannot be a successful Marine. It's just not going to work. How does that look in practice? It looks in practice with you standing at attention in week one with your drill instructor walking in front of you and telling you all the things about your uniform that are wrong. And keep in mind, you've spent probably 12 hours that last night getting them right. Everyone fails. When you make the slightest mistake, you're doing 50 push-ups. When you would like to wear your hair a certain way, your head is shaved. In fact, everyone's head is shaved to begin with so that individual identities go away. So day in and day out, you learn that you in and of yourself can do nothing right. And slowly but surely, you begin to conform to this system. Once you have this common foundation of how the Marine Corps operates, they tell you that now that you have qualified to become a Marine, having passed this boot camp or officer candidate school, your life fundamentally is no longer lived for yourself. For the privilege of becoming a Marine, you now incur the responsibility of living your life first for your mission and second for your Marines. When you have a common foundation and everyone operates with a worldview that is similar in the sense that there is right and there is wrong, it's amazing what you can accomplish as an organization. When you don't have to argue about the very basics about how the world works, how leadership works, how one should think of serving one's unit, one's men, how one should think about accomplishing. When you don't have to worry about that, argue about that, what you can achieve is amazing. But the fundamental premise to building character in the Marines is there is right and there is wrong. And it is very black and white.
Next, we're going to visit a prison where men, hardened criminals, are being trained to have this kind of reflex reaction. Come with us as we talk to inmates in a program run by Prison Fellowship in the Llano Lakes Prison in Minnesota.
My name is Sterling Knox. I'm serving 120 months for second-degree unintentional murder.
My name is Chow Lee. I'm serving 204 months for second-degree intentional murder.
My name is Steve Janicek. I'm serving 100 months for a cruel, cowardly, senseless act of assault.
My name is Bill. I'm serving 88 months for secondary possession of methamphetamines.
You knew what was right and what was wrong, and you just didn't care either way. So, do you guys care now? And what prompted that change?
I care now. I do care now. And what prompted that change? A newfound value on life.
You know, I'm just enlightened to more things and more ways and a truer way of doing life. So that's, with me, that's...
Good. Steve, what's motivating you to care?
Knowing that there's a God there that has forgiven me and that shows me love every day. Knowing what it is to love one another, to have compassion and empathy for another human being, no longer following a corrupt belief system that is nothing but causing pain and harm to other people.
I have a renewed faith in Christ, and it helps me to refocus on what's important. And I've spent enough time taken away from other people. God gave me a lot of gifts, and it's time for me to start giving them to put them for better use other than to manipulate people for self-seeking issues.
What being a part of a community means to me, it's more like I can be me, and I can open myself up for others to see, you know, who I want to be, who I want to leave behind, and give them the opportunity to help usher me towards my goal.
Now, being a community to me is what can I offer the community? What, you know, it's not about me. It's what can I give, and that's what I've come to learn and to try to live out is what can I give instead of what is there to offer them. So.
Living in a community aspect of other brothers that are changing, you know, I have a sense of freedom where, you know, I can open my heart up to others. And then I think of the other people that are coming in just to become part of this community. You know, one of the greatest gifts we can give each other is inspiration.
And here, being a part of the IFI community, being part of community, period, I'm learning that it's okay to be me, that I am, that what I am, what God created me to be is just fine.
From here on out, I'm going to be the person that people can say that this is what you can be, rather than saying this is what you do not want to be.
I'm going to live my life in a fashion that I could leave this place in better shape than which I came.
I'm gonna live my life with integrity and do the difficult right thing.
From here on out, I want to be the man and the father that my children need. I want to be somebody that my old friends, my current friends can say, wow, this is the man that we fell in love with. This is the man that we respect.
Chuck Colson, those 4 people are in your program. How do you get results like that?
Yes, they are. We've been doing this for 13 years, Brit, and we require them to say they'll stay for 18 months because we believe character is learned in community. We believe it's experienced in the relationships, and they talk about being able to work with each other and support each other. It's the same phenomenon you saw in the Marine Corps. Everybody bonds together because if they don't, their lives are going to be lost. So we really have built intentional communities in 9, 10 prisons across America. We're studying the empirical results of the graduates getting out, contrasted with other groups. The national statistics are 60% reoffend within 3 years. Control group that was done in Texas found 20%. Our graduates, and this has been consistent across the board, 8%. So you can really build character. We asked the question at the beginning, how does the rebellious human will be subdued? Here are murderers, thieves, the dregs of society living together but helping one another to develop character.
Now, so what is the idea? What is the concept? What does the trick with these guys?
It's accountability to one another. If anybody signs up for our program, they're going to stay there 18 months, and people have turned down parole to stay in the program. They really want it because I've been in thousands of prisons. I've talked to tens of thousands of inmates. They get out and they do exactly what I did. They rationalize and they get right back in trouble. What they need is a community of people. So what they're finding in our program is they're binding with one another, and then with a mentor when they get out, they make it because then they want to make it.
Glenn Sunshine joins in.
One thing that I find very interesting is there's a very long tradition of this sort of thing within the church. Whether you're dealing with monasteries or groups like the Brethren of the Common Life, which was a lay organization back in the late Middle Ages, there were communities of people who formed for the specific purpose of holding each other accountable and helping each other to learn to live a life of virtue. They actually started almost all of the schools in Northern Europe, the primary schools that taught people to read and write, because they believed it was important to get people able to read the sources of the Christian faith so that they can grow and learn virtue. But what they did is they formed these communities that held each other accountable. They spent time in mutual confession, in organized meditation and things like that. But the whole purpose of it was to teach each other how to take the vices in their life and replace them with virtues. It's always accomplished in community, and it's always accomplished in part as well by teaching them to control how they think.
Apart from faith, whose effects we've all discussed here, we have this common element of accountability to a community. So how do you play that out in a larger society?
Dr. David Miller responds.
In fact, as I'm listening to this powerful conversation of people having transformed lives, transformed behaviors, I'm thinking most of the students in this room probably have not been in the Marine Corps, probably have not been in prison for murdering someone or their professor, hopefully not. So how can one build character? Because there's assumption it can be built. So how do we do that in a modern education system for people who hopefully yet haven't done anything horribly wrong? And I don't have a magic answer, but as I'm thinking to the conversation, I think of the 12-step group. Some of you may have family members who are in AA or Narcotics Anonymous. You all remember the first 2 steps of 12-step groups. The first is to acknowledge that you're completely powerless over that which you are doing that you know you ought not to do. And the second step is to acknowledge that some higher being, doesn't define who or how, but some higher being can give you the strength to overcome that. So I see a fascinating tension, because everyone in this room, they're the nation's best and brightest, all out saying you could do it, and high self-esteem and good grades. And yet there's a common theme throughout these panelists that sooner or later we drop the ball. We do that which we know we ought not to do. So can we hold together that tension of developing our abilities, and yet at the same time with profound humility to say, I cannot do it alone. I cannot do it alone. I need a community, and I also need perhaps some higher power.
I think we need to ask ourselves the question, if we're going to talk about virtue in the larger society, what is the institution that is the fundamental accountability group for most members of our society? And I think it's obvious, it's the family. Now, I don't think any society, no matter how many wonderful prison programs it has, no matter how many great universities or schools it has, any society can be healthy if the institution of the family is not healthy, if it's failing to flourish, because that's the fundamental accountability structure.
Well, the breakdown of the family has been the chief cause of the rise in the prison population from 229,000 to 2.3 million. And Wilson and Herrnstein at Harvard discovered that in 1986. I've seen it firsthand in the faces of thousands of people. It is true.
Well, just to add to this, you asked the question, how do you deal with this in the larger society? And it's kind of been dealt with a little bit. But first of all, it's absolutely the family is fundamental. But I think there are other things as well that need to be developed. And Alexis de Tocqueville talked about the importance. He said, if you're going to have a free society, then you need, well, moral and free people. And you get this through various ways. He said you get this first through local politics, local what he called intermediary institutions or civil society, private organizations, and also through religion. He didn't talk about the family specifically in this part, but I think it's underlying the whole thing. We need communities to help us become flourishing human beings. We learn how to do the right thing on the knees of our mothers and fathers, and then in our churches, in the Lions Club, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's been a breakdown of community, and that needs to be revitalized, and the state can't do it.
For the benefit of the students sitting here, let me give you one practical suggestion. I didn't find this out until I hit my head, went to prison, and my meteoric career went down the drain. I have to hold myself accountable to other people. My wife, my immediate family, my kids. I would make a decision, think of making a decision without talking to them. And I've got a small accountability group, half a dozen people, and I won't make any move without their concurrence. I don't trust myself. That's a good place for you to start. Find 5 or 6 friends and form that kind of an accountability group.
Reason, as we've discussed, can sometimes be no match for passion. So how do we train the human will? Well, we've been given a lot of help today in understanding character development. Our panel has clearly concluded that there is a moral and ethical crisis in America, and that the way out of it is to know what is right, and then, as we've discussed today, to be able to do that. We will turn now in our series to applying these ethical truths and values we've been discussing to the critical area of human life and death. Be sure to stay with us in this series. I'm Brit Hume.
Steve Ryder here again. Thank you for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast and our special presentation of Chuck Colson and Robbie George's series, Doing the Right Thing. Join us next week for part 4, entitled, What Does It Mean to Be Human? And if you're interested in purchasing the Doing the Right Thing DVD series, please come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Steve Ryder. Do good. Be awesome.